Dr. Tim Pernick, and welcome to another episode of Restoring the Right Hand. Today's episode, we're going to be looking at an article in the Health Reformer written in 1873, and we're going to examine who might have authored the article and the motivation for doing so. Anyways, in case you were wondering about my background, I want you to take a look. I put this background up because it is an interesting window about pharmaceutical advertisements. Back in 1901, this advertisement was found in the medical journal entitled the St. Louis Medical Era. What's fascinating about this is if you look, this is Bayer, who still exists today, making pharmaceutical products, and you look at the top, they had heroin hydrochloride. It is interesting how many of these drugs today could not be given. They would be considered deadly poisons, but this is what was advertised back in the day. I just thought I'd put that in there to show you how some things may change as far as the drug paradigm, but some things still remain the same. There are still many drugs that are highly addictive and bad for you that are still given at the behest of regulators and drug companies. Anyways, let's get to the article. Here's the 1873 article in the Health Reformer. It seems to be underneath Dr. Trowell's special department here. However, if you look carefully, you see the breaks in the paragraph. So while it seems to be Dr. Trowell's understanding, there's no guarantee that he actually wrote this. Either way, it's an interesting article which we're going to read, and it's about vaccination and statistics. Here we go. It says the following: nothing is more delusive than statistics. It is a common saying that figures cannot lie, but unless they are normally arranged and properly interpreted, they do lie, and that continually. And of all the false figuring that ever muddled the human mind, none was ever more fallacious than in reference to vaccination and smallpox. I just have to stop right there. This is fascinating that they're writing this back in 1873, and many people would argue that this type of thing is true even to this day. We've just went through a pandemic where there are a lot of questions being asked about a procedure that has been forced in the arms of many people and wondering, have they been played with statistics? We've been told certain things in the beginning at 95% efficacy, and now we're learning that there's a negative efficacy, that the more procedures that someone has, the more likely they're to get sick and be hospitalized. It's fascinating. History does not always repeat itself, but sometimes it certainly rhymes. He goes on, medical men are constantly parading before our eyes huge columns of statistics to prove that vaccination is among the greatest, grandest, and most beneficent discoveries of a learned and liberal medical profession. Wow, certain things do not change. And this, in despite of the ugly facts that the more the people are vaccinated, the more the smallpox does not disappear. And the more people are prevented from having the smallpox by vaccination, the more they die of other diseases. That's kind of interesting because today we note that the more likely you are to suffer heart attacks or heart complications earlier in age seems to correlate with how many procedures you might have had with a mandated medical product. Again, we can see the parallels here. Goes on. The subject of vaccination is just now being rigorously agitated in England, and the ever convenient statistics which are so fluently quoted by pro-vaccinators are being submitted to an ordeal that promises to dissipate them to the winds. This is, of course, really important. At this time in 1873, the anti-vaccinationist league in Great Britain was fighting to repeal the compulsory laws that forced people to take the smallpox vaccine. So they were lobbying, they were holding protests, they were marching through the streets, they were getting members of parliament, physicians, all kinds of people to write letters to do this so that people would no longer be fined or imprisoned for not having gotten their smallpox vaccine. So the pro-vaccination community is now before Parliament, or trying to get before Parliament, to argue how efficacious their product is, as the article continues. Under the Compulsory Vaccination Act passed in 1867, the people of London and other towns who, as a matter of judgment of conscience, refuse to allow their children to be poisoned with the horrible virus are being fined, in some cases imprisoned, because they are too poor to pay the fine. I just have to stop right here. You can see that this was something that was wanted to be done. They were trying to penalize people, fine people, restrict them from traveling, all because they needed this protection, just like today. And it took a sustained effort of liberty minded people to fight against it. As I showed in the beginning, that even though the advertisements have changed and the names of the drugs have changed, they're still not good for you in many cases, and the drug companies have not changed. And I would argue that organized medicine, which holds these things up as a medical sacrament, have not changed either. What has changed is sort of the complacency of the public who have taken for granted their liberties, and they have forgotten this great fight that was before them. But you can see here in the health reform in 1873, this is very much front and center.
Now back to the article.
And as every act of refusal is a misdemeanor, the anti vaccinationists are almost at the mercy of the misguided or malicious persecutors. Meetings are held in various parts of Great Britain in opposition to the compulsory law, and a spirited fortnightly journal called the Anti Vaccinator and Public Health Journal is published by F. Pittman, and he gives the address, and edited by Mr. Pickering of Leeds. Mr. Pickering demonstrates by the statistics of mortality in general and of smallpox in particular that whenever and wherever the figures show a diminished mortality of smallpox, they also prove a greatly increased mortality of several other diseases attributed to vaccination, so that the tables of statistics are fairly turned against the pretensions of the pro-vaccinators. Now, I have to stop right here. This is interesting because there's a debate right now about how all causes of mortality have gone up in the past 2 years. And many people are just saying, well, it's just simply a coincidence. Some argue this has a lot to do with the lockdowns. Other argues this has to do with the mandates. But no one is exactly sure. But what they are noticing is that how many more people have died in comparison to being infected and dying from COVID-19. The all-cause mortality shows that it's something else, not just the virus. And you can see here that as Mr. Pickering is looking at these statistics, he shows that other people died and got sick where they were forced to take the smallpox vaccine. It's kind of interesting to see these parallels. He goes on, it is alleged that scrofula, syphilis, consumption, bronchitis, tabes mesenterica, and atrophy are occasioned by vaccination. On that, the virus of smallpox produces a predisposition to these diseases, and in confirmation, the facts and figures show that the increased mortality of all 6 of these diseases corresponds with the extent to which vaccination has been practiced. Now, you have to understand this. When they call, in those days, when they referred to the virus, they were referring to poison from the vaccine itself. Even Jenner considered the product he promoted a virus or a poison. The word virus in antiquity comes from the words meaning poison. What's fascinating, especially concerning the syphilis, is that even pro-vaccinators admitted before the British Parliament that arm-to-arm vaccination procedures in those days actually spread syphilis among the population. So some of these things, while they may seem hyperbolic, were not. Scrofula, there are wonderful, I shouldn't say wonderful, but there are terrible pictures of people who have gotten skin lesions and scrofula from touching the lesion where they were vaccinated and spreading to their face and down their arm. Consumption would be tuberculosis, and some argue that when you were scraping off the belly of a calf, crust from pustules and turning it into a vaccine, that you might have also put in some other viruses and bacteria, such as tuberculosis. So it's very interesting that you see all this atrophy. Even people today have smallpox scars where there's an atrophied center where the vaccine was given. And those days, when they smeared essentially dried pus on your arm after abrading the skin, you could imagine the atrophy would have been worse because of the amount of filth that was put in there. And I say filth because that's exactly what it was. They had no idea about sanitation. They had no idea about practicing aseptic medicine. They simply took crust that was off the belly of a calf, which had been scratched, and they put in smallpox scabs or other dust. And when that grew to turn into some sort of pus, they then killed the calf, scraped that off, added some glycerin to it, stirred it around, and then they would let it dry, and then that could be given to vaccinators, and people would have their arms scratched, and then they would put this powder into the arm. So you can imagine the amount of bacteria and other things that you would have gotten from that, none of which would have been pretty good. Moreover, science has shown us that they're not even sure if the smallpox virus was anywhere in there, not even the cowpox virus. So, for many cases, nobody knows exactly what people were being vaccinated with. Back to the article. Some of these statistics are frightful, but they do not tell the whole story. For other diseases, as well as these, although to a less extent, may be due to the vaccine infection. Mr. Pickering says the net increase of 60,847 deaths per annum in 6 death causes only is an absolutely frightful. The net increase of 60,847 deaths per annum in 6 death causes only is a fact absolutely frightful to contemplate. There is an epidemic influence at work in our midst, which, in its quiet yet mortal results, sets all our philosophy at defiance, either to detect, to mitigate, or to prevent. The plagues of former times are nothing to it. I can assure the reader that the increase of the 6 diseases above tabulated is advancing with the tide of legislation, and the principles I have enunciated, that the disease rate and the death rate follow the vaccination rate and the pay rate, is confirmed and corroborated beyond all doubt. Now, I just have to stop right here. So, essentially, what he's arguing is that as all the diseases that he mentioned before, with syphilis, scrofula, consumption, bronchitis, tabes, mesenterica, atrophy, all these things which have increased greatly from previous years. And in some cases, you can read some of the old literature, they even argued cancer. As these things rapidly increased, they noticed that it correlated with the increase of mandatory vaccines, the uptake of vaccines, and how much people are getting paid to give those vaccines. It's kind of similar what you think today, all-cause mortality going up as people around the world have been taking a shot which has not been tested the way that we all thought it would be. He concludes, as every intelligent
Physician knows.
that smallpox originates from accumulated filth, especially animal excrement, would it not be better for humanity and more worthy of the conservators of the public health to teach the people hygienic habits and recommend sanitary legislation than to law generate, quote statistics, and to continue the shameful business of infecting the people with the most loathsome and pestilential virus ever known on earth? So this is a great article because so much of it can be applied today. And what is fascinating about it is that when countries did actually clean up the sewage system, did have running water, did clean the cities, the tenement housings, they noticed that the death rates went down. They noticed that more people lived, even if they got the virus. Even in the case of measles, which in some periods of Earth's history was a terrible and infectious disease. In 1962, D.L. Miller, trying to convince people to take the upcoming measles vaccine, talks about how the death rate for measles had seriously plummeted just by the innovations of sanitation, hygiene, nutrition, and better management of disease. In Great Britain at that time, there were
53 million people living in the UK in 1963, and only 132 deaths. This was before a vaccine was available.
So it tells you how well sanitation hygiene worked to help people. And this gentleman makes a good point that this is what is important. Now, what I like about this is that this was published in the Health Reformer. It seems that this was written by Dr. Russell Trawl. However, we don't know for sure. Yes, it's under the special department, but that seems to end right where the break in the pages are. Because if you were to go through the Health Reformer, you would find that you get these little articles here and there without an author. And so you wonder, well, who wrote it? Who put this in here? It very well could have been Trawl, and I think in the book that I co-authored, we do say it's Trawl, but it's not exactly clear, and we said that because that was our best guess. But I want you to see this. Here is the editor of this publication. This is James White. Now, this is fascinating to me because in 1873, James White is the editor of this publication, and his son, W.C. White, talks about how it was when he was a child. He was perfectly healthy, so his mother said, and then he was given a smallpox vaccine and he got very ill. And from that point forward, his mother believed that there was something wrong with it, that it wasn't good. I wonder if the editor here was deeply influenced by that experience. I wonder if this was something that he wrote himself. He very well could have. His good friend Jay and Loughborough would, just in 10 years later, would be heading to Great Britain and actually become a member of the Anti-Vaccinationist League. It seems to me that there was an understanding in our church about the importance of the health message. And they didn't look at these sort of innovations in quote unquote science as the end all be all for health. They regarded it with skepticism. They kept their mind open to look at what was actually happening. They were very skeptical of these mandates and these freedom crunching propositions made by the government. And so when you consider this, you have to ask yourself, what happened? What happened to where we used to have a skeptical voice about these procedures, and we were very much concerned about laws which took the rights away from parents over governing their children and rights away from individuals on what goes into their body? Whatever happened to that? And I think what happened to that is sort of what you see behind me, the growing power of the drug trust, pharmaceutical companies, and the age of professional medicine, which sought to lift up vaccines as a holy sacrament that could never be questioned. It is interesting to note that this is just one of many articles where we have people questioning in the church
The efficacy of the smallpox vaccine and the legitimacy of governmental power to force them into unwilling arms.
we have all these things going on. And so you have to ask yourself, whatever happened to these voices? Where did they go? Why is it that it took a whole pandemic for us to start to have those voices again? I'm actually thankful that many are stepping up to the plate and questioning these things. We do need to question these things. We do need to understand our health message.
Free from the influence of pharmaceutical companies, large medical institutions, and allopathic dogma, which views drugs as a gift from God. And I hope we can learn to view simple remedies.
In a more sympathetic light instead of just simply trusting, thus saith the science. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this short presentation. Please like, subscribe, and thank you for tuning in.